It is one of those curious circumstances in my life that the most extraordinary cases I have ever recorded did not announce themselves with thunder or terror, but rather with a kind of uneasy quietness as, though London itself hesitated before revealing them. The case I am about to set down was no exception. Indeed, when I think back upon it now, I am struck less by the drama of its beginning than by its simplicity, a simplicity which, as Holmes himself would later remark, is often the most deceptive mask a mystery can wear. It was on a damp November morning, the kind that clings to the skin like a persistent thought, that I arrived at Baker Street to find Holmes already awake, already active, and already bored. He was seated in his armchair by the fire, his violin resting neglected on the table beside him, while his fingers tapped out an impatient rhythm upon the armrest. A thin veil of tobacco smoke curled upward, mingling with the fog that pressed against our windows as though London itself were eavesdropping. "You are early, Watson," he said without turning. "I have been at the hospital since dawn," I replied, hanging my coat upon the stand. "And you?" "Since midnight," he answered calmly, "though I confess I have done nothing of consequence." "That sounds unlike you." "On the contrary," he said with a faint smile, "it is the most productive state of all. One eliminates distractions." Before I could inquire further into this philosophy, there came a sharp knock at the door, urgent, uneven, the knuckles striking wood with nervous impatience. Mrs. Hudson, our long-suffering landlady, had barely time to announce the visitor before a man pushed past her into the room. He was not the sort of man one expects to see in Baker Street. His coat was worn but carefully brushed, his boots muddied by long walking, and his hat twisted anxiously in his hands. His face bore the strained pallor of someone who had not slept, and his eyes darted about the room as though expecting it to shift beneath him. "I beg your pardon," he stammered. "Are you Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" Holmes inclined his head slightly. "That depends upon who is asking. My name is Elias Grange," the man said quickly. "I have come from Whitechapel Road. Something terrible has happened, something impossible." Holmes' eyes narrowed just a fraction, the way a cat's might when it senses movement in the dark. "Impossible, Mr. Grange, is merely the word used by those who have not yet found an explanation." The man swallowed hard. "Then perhaps you are the only man in London who can find one." I motioned him to sit, though he remained standing as if afraid the chair might refuse him. Holmes, meanwhile, leaned back slightly, studying him with that peculiar stillness I had come to recognize as the prelude to deduction. "Tell me," Holmes said quietly, "about the room." At this, Grange hesitated. "The room?" "The room you have come to speak of. You mentioned Whitechapel Road, which suggests urban density, older housing structures, narrow interiors. Your agitation suggests not violence in the street, but something contained. Therefore I assume the incident occurred indoors." The man stared at him in astonishment. "At it was a rented room, above a tailor's shop." Holmes nodded once, as though confirming a calculation. "And what makes it impossible?" I asked gently, though I already felt the familiar stirring of curiosity. Grange turned to me now, as if grateful for a more human presence. "Because the room was empty, Doctor. Completely empty. And yet something was taken from it." Holmes' expression did not change, but I noticed his fingers had stopped moving. "Taken?" he repeated. But there was no sign of entry. No broken lock, no open window, no disturbance whatsoever. The door was still locked from the inside when the landlord arrived. "And what precisely," Holmes asked, leaning forward now, "was missing?" Grange hesitated again. "A man." The silence that followed was not merely absence of sound, it was presence of thought. Even the fire seemed to pause in its crackling. Holmes rose slowly to his feet. "A man cannot simply vanish from a locked room," he said softly. "Unless, of course, he was never there in the manner assumed." Grange shook his head violently. No, he was there. I saw him yesterday evening myself. Mr. Calderwood, a quiet gentleman recently arrived, kept to himself. The landlord saw him enter. The neighbor heard him moving about during the night. And yet, Holmes said, this morning he is gone." "And the room?" I asked. Grange hesitated. "Untouched. His coat still hangs on the peg. His luggage is still there. Even his pipe rests on the table, half-smoked." Holmes exchanged a glance with me, then a brief, sharp flicker of interest. The sort of glance that always meant, "This is not ordinary, Watson." "And the lock?" Holmes asked. "Still locked. The key was inside when the door was opened." Holmes stepped closer to the man, studying him now with renewed intensity. "Mr. Grange," he said, You will forgive me if I say that your story is either a fabrication or an incomplete truth. Men do not vanish from locked rooms. Therefore, either your perception is flawed or your facts are incomplete." Grange flushed. "I am telling you everything I know." "Then you know too little," Holmes replied calmly. There was a pause before Holmes turned away, retrieving his coat from the hook. "Watson," he said over his shoulder, "we shall go to Whitechapel Road at once." I confess I felt a small thrill at his words. There are cases that arrive like storms already broken, and others that begin like this one, quiet, uncertain, and all the more dangerous for it. As we prepared to leave, I noticed Holmes pause beside the mantelpiece, staring into the fire with unusual stillness. "An empty room," he murmured almost to himself, "or a room made to appear empty." Then, with a sudden briskness, he reached for his hat. "Come, Watson. The first step in any investigation is to ensure that the impossible has not been carefully arranged." Outside, London was wrapped in its usual November gloom. The gas lamps burned like tired eyes through the fog as our cab rattled through the narrow streets toward Whitechapel. I remember watching Holmes during the journey, his silence deeper than usual, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the passing streets, as though the city itself were already revealing its secrets to him in advance. And I, as always, could only wait for the moment when he would begin to speak them aloud. Little did I know then that we were not merely approaching a missing man, but something far more intricate, something that would test not only Holmes' intellect, but the very boundaries of what a room could conceal. The journey through London that morning seemed longer than it truly was, for the fog had a way of distorting distance, swallowing familiar streets, and returning them in unfamiliar shapes. Whitechapel, when we arrived, appeared less like a district of the city, and more like a memory that London itself preferred not to revisit. Our cab drew to a halt before a narrow, soot-stained building pressed tightly between two older structures. Beneath it lay a tailor's shop, modest and unremarkable above it, the rented rooms where Elias Grange insisted the impossible had occurred. Holmes stepped out first, his gaze already fixed upon the building. "Number 13, Grange muttered uneasily, following behind us. "Ah," said Holmes softly, "a number that frightens those who prefer superstition to thought." He said it lightly, but his eyes were already narrowing as they studied the upper windows, the alignment of the walls, the slight irregularities in the brickwork that most men would never notice. Without further comment, he led the way inside. The room above the tailor. The staircase creaked beneath our steps, each sound echoing through the narrow passage like a protest. At the top, a small landing led to a single door. It was here, Grange told us, that Mr. Calderwood had been staying. Holmes did not knock. He simply turned the handle. The door opened, and nothing happened. That in itself was the first strange thing. No disturbance, no sense of intrusion, only a room waiting in silence, as though it had never been occupied at all. Inside, everything appeared entirely ordinary. A narrow bed stood against the wall. A small writing table rested beside it. A chair slightly turned. A coat hung neatly upon a peg. Even a half-finished pipe lay on the table, its contents cold and untouched since the last smoke. Yet the man who had used these things was gone, completely gone. Holmes begins to observe. Holmes stepped inside without hesitation. His movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely silent. He did not look at the furniture in the way most men would. He looked at it as though it might confess something if pressed correctly. "Watson," he said quietly, "tell me what you see." "A man's room," I replied. "Left in haste." Holmes gave a faint shake of his head. "That is what you assume, not what you observe." He walked first to the door. The lock was intact, the key still in the room. There were no scratches, no forced entry, no sign of struggle. "Locked from within," he murmured, a phrase that has ruined more minds than it has rooms. Next he moved to the window. It was closed and secured from the inside. A thin layer of dust covered the sill undisturbed. "No exit here," he said. Then he paused, and turned his attention downward, the floor that spoke. Holmes knelt slowly near the bed. For a moment he said nothing. Then he placed his fingertips lightly upon the wooden floorboards. "Watson," he said at last, "come here." I obeyed immediately. He pointed to faint marks barely visible unless one knew exactly where to look. Long, shallow scratches in the wood, running in a slightly irregular direction. "What do you make of them?" he asked. I studied them carefully. "Scratches, perhaps from furniture being moved." Holmes shook his head. "Too directional, too deliberate. These are not marks of furniture." He rose slowly. "These are drag marks." A silence followed those words. Grange shifted uneasily behind us. "Drag marks?" I repeated. "Yes," said Holmes. "Something was moved across this floor. Something that did not wish to be moved. A room that should not exist." The implications of his observation settled heavily in the room. Grange's voice broke the silence. "I told you," he said sharply. "Mr. Calderwood was here. He was real. I saw him with my own eyes." Holmes turned slightly toward him. "I do not doubt that you saw something," he said calmly. "The question is whether you understood what you saw." Grange opened his mouth, but no words came. Holmes returned to the center of the room, his gaze now distant, almost inward. "This is not a disappearance," he said softly. "Not in the conventional sense." He paused. "This is an arrangement. The first hint of something wrong." He moved toward the coat hanging on the peg. With careful fingers he examined the pockets, the seams, the lining. Nothing appeared unusual, yet Holmes lingered. That, I had learned over years of observation, was never accidental. "Half-finished pipe," he said. "No ash discarded. No sign of interruption." He turned the pipe slightly between his fingers. "A man who was interrupted while smoking would leave evidence of haste. This pipe suggests—" He looked up at me. "And yet the man is gone." A chill passed through me that had nothing to do with the November air. Holmes withdraws into thought. For several minutes Holmes said nothing. He stood in the center of the room, perfectly still, as though listening to something only he could hear. His eyes moved slowly from object to object, not with curiosity but with calculation. At last he spoke again. "Watson," he said, "this room has not lost a man." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "It has lost a position." The statement made no immediate sense, and I knew better than to interrupt his thought process. Holmes continued. "Everything here is staged to suggest occupancy without continuity. The pipe suggests recent activity. The coat suggests presence. The furniture suggests routine." He turned sharply toward the bed. "And yet nothing here confirms time." Grange looked confused. "Time?" Holmes nodded. "Yes, time is the missing element. Departure." Without another word, Holmes stepped back toward the door. "We are done here for now," he said. "Done?" I asked, surprised. "For the moment," he replied. "We have confirmed the most important fact." "And that is?" He paused at the threshold. "That this room is lying." Then he looked at Grange. "Mr. Grange," he said, "you will come with us. There are questions you have not yet been asked." Grange hesitated, then nodded weakly. As we descended the stairs, I could not shake the uneasy feeling that we had not stepped closer to solving the mystery. We had only stepped closer to understanding how carefully it had been constructed. The morning air had grown heavier by the time we left the rented room above the tailor's shop. Whitechapel seemed to close in around us as we stepped back into its narrow streets, as though the district itself resented being observed too closely. The fog, already thick, now carried a faint smell of coal smoke and damp stone, clinging to our coats and curling around our boots with unwelcome familiarity. Elias Grange walked between us in silence. Whatever hope had brought him to Baker Street now seemed replaced by a quieter fear, the kind that grows when reality begins to refuse explanation. Holmes, however, appeared unaffected. If anything, his mind had grown sharper, more alert, as though the mystery had not confused him but awakened him. "We will begin where all rational inquiries must begin," he said at last, breaking the silence. "With witnesses." Grange looked up quickly. "The landlord?" "The landlord," Holmes confirmed, "and anyone else who claims to have seen Mr. Calderwood." The landlord's story. The tailor's shop below was small and dimly lit, its air filled with the faint scent of fabric dye and dust. Behind the counter stood a stout man with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers. This, we learned, was Mr. Hargreaves, the landlord. He greeted us with cautious politeness, though his gaze lingered on Holmes with visible unease. "I've told the police everything," he said defensively. "There's nothing more to add." Holmes smiled faintly. "The police ask questions. I prefer answers." That simple distinction, as always, shifted the atmosphere immediately. Holmes began without preamble. "Mr. Hargreaves, when did you last see Mr. Calderwood alive?" "Last night," the landlord replied. "Around 10. He came down briefly to ask for oil for his lamp." "Quiet man." "Polite." "Nothing unusual." "And after that?" "He went back upstairs. I locked the shop as usual and went to bed." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "You locked the shop, and no one entered or left after that point?" "Not that I saw." Holmes paused. "That is an interesting phrase," he said softly. "Not that you saw." The landlord frowned. "Well, I mean, I would have noticed." Holmes stepped closer. "Would you?" A silence followed. Then Holmes continued. "Tell me, Mr. Hargreaves, is there any other access to the upper rooms besides the internal staircase?" The landlord hesitated. "There is a rear alley, a small window at the back of the upper landing, but it's too narrow for a man to pass through comfortably." "Comfort is irrelevant," Holmes said. "Possibility is not. The rear alley." Within minutes we were standing in the narrow alley behind the building. It was little more than a slit between two walls, choked with refuse and shadow. The air here was colder, sharper, and carried the faint echo of dripping water. Holmes immediately turned his attention upward. "There," he said, pointing. A small window sat high above us, barely visible unless one knew to look for it. It was closed. "Was this window secured last night?" Holmes asked. "I assume so," Grange replied. "It's always kept shut." Holmes did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied the wall, the positioning of the bricks, the angle of the drain pipe running upward beside it. Then, without warning, he stepped back. "Watson," he said, "what do you observe?" I looked carefully. "The window is too high to reach without assistance, and the alley is too narrow for a ladder to be placed easily." "Correct again." Holmes nodded. "And yet," he said, "something tells me this alley has been used recently." He crouched down. There, near the base of the wall, were faint impressions in the damp ground, disturbances in the mud that were almost invisible unless studied closely. Footprints, but not ordinary ones. They were partial, uneven, and strangely spaced. Holmes examined them silently for several moments. Then he spoke. "Watson, these prints are not leaving the alley." I frowned. "Not leaving?" "No," he said. "They are entering." That statement unsettled me more than I expected. "Then someone came in through here?" "Possibly," Holmes said, "but not in the way you imagine." A disappearing direction. Holmes traced the footprints carefully, following their faint path along the wall. They led not toward the shop, but toward a dead end where the alley narrowed further. And then, abruptly, they stopped. No continuation. No return. No explanation. Just disappearance. Grange looked visibly shaken. "But that's impossible. You can't just stop walking and vanish." Holmes stood slowly. "That," he said, "is precisely what makes it interesting." He turned toward me. "Watson, what do we know so far?" I considered carefully. A man enters a room. The room is locked from inside. The man disappears. No forced entry. No exit. Holmes nodded approvingly. "And now?" I hesitated. "We have footprints that end without leaving." "Exactly." He looked back toward the building. "Which means we are dealing with a case where movement exists without continuity." Grange looked between us. "I don't understand any of this." Holmes' tone softened slightly. "That is because you are thinking in terms of people," he said. "You should be thinking in terms of structure, the first hint of pattern." We returned upstairs once more, Holmes moving with renewed intensity. This time he examined not the objects, but the space itself, the distances between furniture, the alignment of the walls, the subtle inconsistencies in the room's geometry. At one point he stopped near the center. "Watson," he said quietly, "stand here." I obeyed. "Now look around you. Do you notice anything unusual about the proportions of this room?" I looked carefully. At first nothing seemed wrong, but then, slowly, I realized something subtle. The room felt slightly, not physically distorted, but perceptually inconsistent. One corner seemed marginally closer than it should be. The door slightly misaligned with the window's visual axis. "I see it," I said slowly, "but I cannot explain it." Holmes nodded. "That," he said, "is the beginning of understanding." Holmes' first conclusion. He walked to the door once more, placing his hand gently on the wood. "This room," he said, "is not built to deceive the eye." He paused. "It is built to deceive memory." Grange stared at him. "Memory?" "Yes," Holmes said. "People trust what they remember seeing. But memory is not observation. It is reconstruction." He turned sharply. "And this room has been reconstructed after the fact." The implication hung heavily in the air. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "You mean," I said slowly, "that the room we are seeing is not the same room as when Mr. Calderwood was here?" Holmes gave a slight smile. "Now you are beginning to ask the correct question." A sudden decision. Without further explanation, Holmes took his coat and moved toward the door. "We are not finished," I said. "No," he replied. "We are simply not yet in the right place." Grange followed quickly. "Where are we going now?" Holmes paused at the threshold. "To find what this room is hiding," he said calmly, "we must first understand what it was built to replace." And with that he stepped out into the fog once more. By the time we reached Scotland Yard, the fog had thickened into something almost tangible. London no longer felt like a city, but a labyrinth of shadows and uncertain shapes. The gas lamps along the embankment burned weakly, their light struggling to penetrate the damp air. Even the sounds of carriage wheels seemed muffled, as though the city itself had begun to listen rather than speak. Inspector Lestrade was waiting for us. He stood in the entrance hall of Scotland Yard with the tired posture of a man who had already decided the case was beneath him, yet had not been allowed the luxury of ignoring it. When he saw Holmes, his expression tightened slightly. "Holmes," he said curtly, "I suppose you've come about the Whitechapel disappearance." "Not about it," Holmes replied calmly as he removed his gloves. "For it." Lestrade exhaled through his nose, half irritation, half resignation. "Then you'll be interested to know," he said, "that we already have a suspect." Holmes' eyes sharpened instantly. "Indeed?" "The arrested man." We were led down a narrow corridor into a small interrogation room. Inside sat a man in his mid-30s, hands cuffed loosely in front of him, shoulders slumped forward. He looked exhausted, rather than dangerous, more like someone who had been dragged into a story he did not understand than the author of any crime. "This is Arthur Bell," Lestrade announced, "a porter from the railway yards near Aldgate." Bell looked up as we entered. His eyes flickered nervously between us. "I didn't do anything," he said immediately. "I swear it. I don't even know the man you're talking about." Holmes said nothing at first. He simply observed. That silence, I had learned, was often more revealing than any question. Lestrade continued. "He was seen near Whitechapel Road last night, roughly around the time your missing man was last reported, and he matches a description of someone loitering near the building." Holmes stepped closer to Bell. "Tell me," he said softly, "what were you doing near that building?" "I told him already," Bell replied quickly. "I was delivering crates. The railway sent me. I finished late. I walked through Whitechapel to get home. That's all." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "And the crates?" "Food supplies. Nothing valuable." "Did anyone accompany you?" "No." Holmes paused. "Did anyone see you enter the alley behind the tailor's shop?" Bell frowned. "I don't even know what shop you're talking about." A faint silence settled in the room. Lestrade folded his arms. "He's lying, Holmes. It's obvious. The timeline fits too neatly." Holmes did not respond immediately. Instead he studied Bell's hands, then his boots, then his coat. Finally he spoke. Holmes' first doubt. "Inspector," Holmes said quietly, "tell me exactly what evidence places this man at the scene." Lestrade hesitated. "Witness testimony. A night watchman saw him near the alley, and there are footprints partially matching his boot size." Holmes nodded slowly. "Partially matching," he repeated. He turned back to Bell. "Stand up," Holmes said. Bell hesitated, then complied. Holmes circled him once, slowly. "Walk," Holmes said. "What?" "Walk across the room." Bell looked confused, but obeyed. Holmes watched every step. Then he turned back to Lestrade. "This man is not your culprit." Lestrade frowned sharply. "And how do you conclude that so quickly?" "Because," Holmes said calmly, "he walks with the gait of someone accustomed to carrying weight evenly distributed, not someone who has dragged anything substantial across uneven ground." Bell blinked in confusion. "I told you I didn't." Holmes raised a hand slightly. "I am not defending you," he said. "I am merely removing you from consideration, the problem with the suspect." Lestrade looked increasingly irritated. "You always do this, Holmes. You dismiss the obvious and chase shadows." Holmes turned to him. "No, Inspector," he said. "I dismiss the convenient." He reached into his pocket and produced a small notebook. "Your witness places this man near the alley," Holmes continued. "But witness memory is unreliable under fog, distance, and poor lighting. Your footprint evidence is partial and therefore contaminated by assumption." Lestrade's jaw tightened. "So you're saying we have nothing?" "I am saying," Holmes corrected, "that you have been given a surface explanation for a depth problem." Bell sank back into his chair, visibly relieved but still frightened. "I just want to go home," he muttered. Holmes glanced at him briefly. "You may go," he said. Lestrade snapped his head up. "Why?" "He is not connected to the disappearance," Holmes repeated. "Detaining him will waste time you cannot afford." Lestrade looked as though he wanted to argue further, but something in Holmes' tone stopped him. Reluctantly, he signaled for Bell's release. After the arrest, when we left the interrogation room, Lestrade followed us into the corridor, clearly dissatisfied. "You're making a mistake," he said. "No," Holmes replied. "I am correcting one." Lestrade stopped walking. "Then explain it," he demanded. "If not him, then who?" Holmes paused near the window of the corridor. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. "That," he said quietly, "is the wrong question." Lestrade frowned. "What do you mean?" Holmes turned slightly. "You are asking who disappeared a man from a locked room. I am asking something entirely different. And that is?" Holmes' voice lowered slightly. "Why the room was designed so that disappearance was the only logical conclusion." A silence followed. Even Lestrade, usually quick to dismiss Holmes' abstractions, said nothing. A new direction. As we left Scotland Yard, the fog outside seemed thicker still, as though it had been waiting for us. Grange, who had remained silent through the entire exchange, finally spoke. "If that man isn't responsible," he said weakly, "then what am I supposed to believe happened?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked back toward the direction of Whitechapel. "You are supposed to stop believing in the obvious," he said at last. He began walking again. "And start observing what remains when the obvious is removed." I followed beside him. "Holmes," I said quietly, "you believe this is more than a disappearance?" He gave a faint, almost absent smile. "I believe," he said, "that someone wanted a man to disappear in such a way that every simple explanation would be wrong." He paused. "And that is never done without purpose." A subtle shift. We walked in silence for several minutes. The city around us felt altered, less like a place and more like a puzzle that refused to show its full shape. At one point Holmes stopped suddenly. "Watson," he said. "Yes?" "Did you notice anything missing in the room?" I thought carefully. "The man," I said. Holmes shook his head. "That is the consequence." He turned to me. "I am asking about the cause." I hesitated. Then I realized. "The chair," I said slowly. "It was slightly out of alignment." Holmes nodded once. "Exactly." He began walking again. "That room," he said, "does not lose people." He paused. "It rearranges them." And with that unsettling statement hanging in the air, we continued into the fog. The fog had not lifted by the time we returned once more to Whitechapel, though it had changed in character. It no longer merely obscured vision, it seemed to resist inquiry, as though London itself had grown wary of our investigation. Even the sound of our footsteps upon the cobbled streets felt subdued, swallowed before it could fully form. Holmes walked ahead with a steady, deliberate pace, his expression unreadable. Grange followed at a distance, his earlier confidence now entirely dissolved. As for myself, I could not rid my mind of Holmes' last remark that the room did not lose people but rearrange them. It was the kind of statement that lingered uncomfortably, refusing to resolve itself into meaning. We stopped once more at the tailor's shop. Holmes did not enter. Instead, he stood outside for a long moment, studying the building from the street. Then he said quietly, "Watson, I want you to observe something carefully. The building that does not agree with itself." I followed his gaze upward. The upper window, the one leading to the room of Mr. Calderwood, looked unchanged from before. Ordinary. Yet Holmes was not looking at the window itself. He was looking at the alignment of the building. "Do you notice anything unusual about the structure?" he asked. I studied it again. At first nothing appeared wrong. The building was old, slightly uneven perhaps, but typical of Whitechapel's aging architecture. "I see nothing obvious," I admitted. Holmes nodded as though expecting this answer. "That is precisely the problem," he said. "The human eye corrects inconsistency. It assumes balance even where none exists." He stepped slightly to the side. "Now look again." I adjusted my position, and then I saw it. The upper window did not align perfectly with the doorway below it. The vertical symmetry that one would expect in a building of this type was subtly incorrect, not dramatically, but enough to create a persistent discomfort in perception. "It is slightly offset," I said slowly. "Yes," Holmes replied. "And that is not accidental, a detail missed by everyone." Holmes walked forward and placed his hand lightly against the outer wall. "This building has been modified," he said. Grange frowned. "Modified?" "It's been here for years." "Precisely why the modification is so effective," Holmes replied. "No one questions what appears familiar." He turned to me. "Watson, when we first entered the room above, did anything strike you as structurally wrong?" I thought back carefully. "No," I said. "Everything seemed ordinary." Holmes' eyes narrowed slightly. "And yet you felt something was off?" "Yes." He nodded. "That feeling," he said, "is your mind detecting contradiction before your logic can interpret it. The concealed truth." Without warning, Holmes moved toward the alley behind the building again. We followed quickly. This time he did not search the ground or the walls. Instead, he studied the drain-pipe, the brickwork, and the narrow space between the buildings with intense focus. Then he stopped. "Watson," he said quietly, "tell me what connects the alley to the upper room." "A staircase inside," I replied. "Correct," he said. "And what else?" I hesitated. "Nothing else that I know of." Holmes smiled faintly. "That is because you are assuming the room is accessed only by conventional means." He stepped closer to the wall. "Look here!" I approached. At first I saw nothing, but Holmes pointed to a seam in the brickwork barely visible, almost perfectly blended into the structure. "What is that?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he pressed his fingers gently along the seam. And then I saw it move, not much, not dramatically, but enough. A section of the wall shifted inward by a fraction of an inch. My breath caught. "That is not part of the original structure," I said. "No," Holmes replied. "It is an addition, a concealed mechanism." Holmes reveals a partial truth. Grange stepped back, visibly shaken. "What does that mean?" he asked. Holmes turned toward him. "It means," he said calmly, "that your missing man was not in a simple room." He paused. "He was in a constructed environment designed to alter perception of entry and exit." I frowned. "You mean a hidden passage?" Holmes shook his head. "Not hidden," he corrected. "Integrated." He stepped away from the wall. "This building contains structural deception. The room above is not isolated. It is part of a larger system." A silence followed his words. Even the fog seemed to pause. The inconsistency that changes everything. Holmes began walking again, now more slowly, as though assembling thoughts in real time. "Watson," he said, "do you remember the drag marks on the floor? And the footprints in the alley that ended abruptly?" He nodded. "Individually they are meaningless. Together they are contradictory." He stopped walking. "And contradiction is never accidental." Grange looked increasingly distressed. "So what are you saying happened to Calderwood?" Holmes turned slightly. "I am saying," he replied, "that we have been misled into believing we are dealing with absence." He paused. "When in fact we are dealing with relocation." A thought not shared. As we walked back toward Baker Street later that afternoon, Holmes fell into one of his silences, the kind I had learned not to interrupt. Yet I could sense that his mind was no longer on Whitechapel alone. It was elsewhere. Something about the hidden mechanism, the structural inconsistency, had shifted his thinking into a deeper layer of analysis. At one point he spoke without looking at me. "Watson," he said, "did you notice I did not mention one detail inside the room?" I thought carefully. "Which one?" He replied quietly. "The absence of dust disturbance beneath the bed." I frowned. "Is that significant?" Holmes' expression darkened slightly. "It is only significant," he said, "when one assumes the room was empty after the fact." He said nothing more, but I understood then that he had already begun to see something I had not yet been shown. London had a way of changing its character after dusk, as though the city itself shed one personality and adopted another when the gas lamps were lit. On that evening the fog was not merely present, it was oppressive, pressing against the streets like a living curtain drawn too tightly over a stage already set for tragedy. We had scarcely returned to Baker Street when Holmes' silence deepened into something more focused, more distant. He had not spoken for nearly an hour. Instead, he sat by the fireplace with his fingertips pressed together, eyes fixed not on the flame but on something beyond it. Grange remained seated near the window, still visibly shaken by what we had uncovered at Whitechapel. As for myself, I was attempting to record my observations, though I confess my thoughts kept returning to Holmes' unsettling suggestion that Calderwood had not vanished, but been relocated. The knock at our door came abruptly. Repeated. "Mrs." Hudson barely had time to open it before a young man stumbled into the room. He was breathless, disheveled, and pale. "Mr. Holmes," he cried, "please, something terrible has happened again." Holmes rose instantly. A new visitor, a new panic. The man introduced himself as Thomas Red, a clerk from a shipping office near the docks. His voice trembled as he spoke, words spilling out faster than he could properly control. "It's another room," he said, "just like before. A man—" Grange stood abruptly. "Another one?" Holmes did not react outwardly, but I noticed the faint tightening of his gaze, the slightest indication of renewed interest. "Sit down," Holmes said calmly. and begin at the beginning." Red obeyed, though barely. "It happened this afternoon," he said. "A storage office at the docks. A man named Edward Linley was working late. He was supposed to meet a supervisor at 6. When they arrived, the office was locked from inside. Just like before." Holmes' eyes sharpened. "Go on." "They broke the door," Red continued. "No one inside. No sign of exit. His coat was still on the chair. Papers untouched. The room A heavy silence filled the room. Grange looked at Holmes. "This is the same pattern." Holmes raised a hand slightly. "Not the same," he said softly. "A repetition with variation is not duplication. It is design." The pattern expands. Holmes paced slowly across the room, his thoughts visibly assembling themselves. "A second room," he said. "Different location, different victim, same structural impossibility." He stopped. "Watson, what does that suggest to you?" I hesitated. "A method," I said finally. "Not a coincidence." Holmes nodded once. "Precisely." He turned back to read. "Tell me about the office. Its structure." Red blinked. "It's just a small storage room. One door, one window. Nothing unusual." "Was it inspected beforehand?" Holmes asked. "Yeah." "It's used daily. Nothing hidden there." Holmes' expression darkened slightly. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly what concerns me." The escalation. Holmes immediately began gathering his coat. "We go at once," he said. Grange stood quickly. "Another case? But we haven't even solved the first." "We have not even understood the first," Holmes corrected. Reed swallowed nervously. Is this connected?" Holmes paused for a moment before answering. "I do not yet know," he admitted. "But two identical impossibilities in different locations rarely exist in isolation." He turned to me. "Watson, come!" The dockside office. The journey to the docks took longer than expected, the fog thickening with each passing street until even the outlines of buildings seemed uncertain. The sound of water against stone accompanied us as we neared the river, a steady, rhythmic reminder of movement in contrast to the stillness of the mystery we pursued. The shipping office was small, wedged between larger warehouses. A crowd had already gathered outside the dock workers, policemen, curious onlookers. Inspector Lestrade was there as well. He greeted us with visible irritation. "Holmes," he said. "Another one." "So I see," Holmes replied. Lestrade gestured toward the building. "Same situation. Locked room. Empty inside." Holmes did not respond immediately. He was already observing. Then he stepped forward. Inside the second room, the office interior was plain, functional, and utterly unremarkable. A desk, shelves lined with shipping records, a single window overlooking the dockyard. And yet the moment Holmes entered, his expression changed. Not surprise, recognition. He moved directly to the center of the room. "Watson," he said quietly, "observe carefully." I did. The room felt, not visually but structurally again, the same subtle dissonance we had seen before. Holmes pointed to the desk. "Position," he said, "slightly misaligned with the window axis." He walked to the window. "Light fall is inconsistent with expected angle." He turned sharply. "And the floor?" He crouched. Once again faint marks, not identical but similar. Dragging impressions. Holmes exhaled slowly. "It is the same hand," he said quietly. "A second clue emerges." Lestrade frowned. "What are you talking about?" Holmes stood. "Inspector," he said calmly, "this is no longer a single disappearance." He gestured around the room. "This is a system being tested." Lestrade scoffed. "System? You mean someone is abducting men from locked rooms for sport?" Holmes' voice dropped slightly. "No," he said. "For refinement." A silence followed. Even Lestrade did not interrupt. Holmes turned to me. "Watson," he said, "you see the implication now?" I hesitated. "Yes," I said slowly. "The rooms are not random. They are constructed similarly." Holmes nodded. "And repeated," he added, with increasing precision. Grange spoke faintly. "But why?" Holmes looked toward the window. "That," he said, "is what we are now being invited to discover, the rising tension. As we left the office, the river wind struck us sharply, carrying with it a sense of unease that was difficult to define. 2 disappearances, 2 locked rooms, 2 identical impossibilities. Yet Holmes seemed less confused than focused, and that, more than anything, unsettled me. Because I had learned that when Sherlock Holmes was no longer puzzled, it meant he was beginning to see the shape of something others could not yet imagine. As we walked back into the fog, he spoke quietly, almost to himself. "Watson," he said, "we are no longer dealing with absence." I looked at him. "What are we dealing with then?" He paused before answering. "Engineering. London by night is a city that pretends to sleep. Yet on that evening it felt as though it was only pretending, restless beneath its fog, shifting uneasily like a man troubled by a dream he cannot remember. The river carried a dull, heavy sound, and even the gas lamps seemed dimmer, as though reluctant to illuminate what lay ahead. We had returned from the docks with more questions than answers. 2 rooms, 2 disappearances, and now a pattern that was beginning to resemble not chaos but intention. Holmes said very little on our way back to Baker Street. That in itself was never a good sign. When Holmes became silent, it was not because he lacked thought, but because he had begun to see too many directions at once. Grange paced nervously in the corner of the room. Reed had left earlier, still shaken. Lestrade had returned to Scotland Yard with promises of proper investigation, though Holmes had not bothered to correct him. Only I remained in Baker Street to witness what came next. Holmes changes his approach. At approximately 10 o'clock, Holmes suddenly stood. "Watson," he said, "we have been thinking incorrectly." I looked up from my notes. "In what way?" "In assuming that these rooms are failures of entry and exit," he replied. "They are not." He began pacing slowly. "They are demonstrations." Grange frowned. "Demonstrations of what?" Holmes stopped. "Of control." A silence followed. Then he continued. "If someone can remove a man from a locked room without visible entry or exit, they are not committing a crime in the conventional sense. They are testing a principle." I felt a chill at his words. "Then what principle?" I asked. Holmes looked at me briefly. "That is what we are going to find out." A sudden shift in direction. Without warning, Holmes retrieved his coat again. "We are going out," he said. Grange looked startled. "Again? Where now?" Holmes adjusted his gloves. "To follow the misdirection," he replied calmly. I frowned. "Misdirection?" "Yes," Holmes said. "Because someone is guiding our interpretation." That statement lingered heavily in the air. The first false trail. We arrived at a small public house near Aldgate where, according to Lestrade's earlier notes, Edward Linley, the second missing man, had been seen the night before his disappearance. Holmes entered without hesitation. Inside, the atmosphere was warm, noisy, and entirely indifferent to our presence. The bartender barely looked up as Holmes approached. "We are investigating a missing man," Holmes said. The bartender shrugged. "Plenty of those around here." Holmes leaned slightly forward. "Edward Linley." The name produced a reaction, subtle but present. The bartender hesitated. "Ah." Holmes' eyes sharpened instantly. "Tell me." The man scratched his chin. "He wasn't alone, if that's what you're asking. He was talking to someone." "With whom?" Holmes asked. "A woman," the bartender said. Grange stiffened slightly. "A woman?" "Yes," the bartender continued. "Dark coat, quiet, kept to herself. She asked him a lot of questions." Holmes said nothing for a moment. "Then, do you remember anything else?" The bartender hesitated again. "She mentioned Whitechapel," he said finally. "Something about rooms that remember." I felt my breath catch slightly. Holmes, however, remained still. A carefully planted clue. We left the pub shortly after, stepping back into the fog. Grange was visibly unsettled. "A woman now?" he said. "Does this mean—" Holmes interrupted him. "No," he said firmly. Grange blinked. "But the bartender was not lying," Holmes said. "But he was repeating something that was given to him." I frowned. "Given?" Holmes nodded. "Information planted deliberately." He turned slightly toward me. "Watson, what is the easiest way to mislead an investigation?" I thought for a moment. "By giving false evidence?" "No," Holmes said. "By giving true fragments arranged incorrectly." That statement stayed with me. The second layer of deception. Later that night, Holmes had us revisit the alley behind the Whitechapel building. This time he did not search for footprints or mechanical traces. Instead, he observed the timing of everything. "How long does fog settle after movement?" he asked suddenly. I hesitated. "Minutes, perhaps longer, depending on air currents." Holmes nodded. "And how long does it take for disturbed dust inside a sealed room to resettle?" "Again, minutes to hours." He looked at me. "Then tell me, Watson, why were both rooms discovered in identical states of stillness?" I frowned. "Because they were empty?" Holmes shook his head. "Because they were prepared." Holmes begins to allow confusion. As the night deepened, something unusual began to happen. Holmes stopped correcting every assumption immediately. Instead, he allowed contradictions to stand. Grange noticed this first. "You are not explaining things as you usually do," he said cautiously. Holmes replied without looking at him. "Because explanations are being offered too early." That was all he said. But I understood the implication. Holmes was no longer merely investigating the case. He was now testing the case itself, a controlled mystery. Back at Baker Street, Holmes laid out what little we knew on the table. 2 rooms, 2 men. Identical conditions, locked interiors, no exits, no forced entry. Yet now there was something new. A woman, a phrase, rooms that remember. Holmes tapped the table lightly. "This is not random," he said. "It is structured narrative." Grange looked confused. "Narrative?" "Yes," Holmes said. "Someone is constructing meaning for us." I frowned. "You mean they are trying to guide our conclusions?" Holmes nodded. "Precisely. The turning point." He stood suddenly. "And now," he said, "we stop following." Grange blinked. "Stop following what?" Holmes looked at him directly. "The story they are trying to tell us." A silence followed. Then Holmes picked up his coat once more. "Watson," he said, "we will now begin to find what they did not intend us to see." I understood then that the case had changed again. We were no longer reacting. We were entering resistance. The atmosphere in Baker Street that night carried an unusual weight, as though the very walls had begun to absorb the tension of our inquiry. The fire burned low, casting long, shifting shadows across the room, and even the familiar comfort of our surroundings felt altered, less like a sanctuary and more like a waiting ground before something inevitable. Holmes had not slept. That alone would not have concerned me under ordinary circumstances, but this was not ordinary work. This was a case that had already defied logic twice, and now appeared to be shaping itself into something far more deliberate. Grange sat near the window, silent and exhausted. I remained by the table watching Holmes as he moved with quiet precision, preparing something I could not yet understand. On the table lay a series of maps, notes, and sketches of both Whitechapel and the dockside office. Yet Holmes was not studying them in the way one studies evidence. He was arranging them, like a strategist preparing a battlefield, a decision without explanation. At last Holmes spoke. "Watson," he said calmly, "I will not be accompanying you tomorrow." I looked up sharply. "Not accompanying me?" "No," he replied. "I will be elsewhere." Grange frowned. "Elsewhere? Then what are we supposed to do?" Holmes turned slightly toward him. "You will continue what you believe is investigation," he said. "You will allow yourselves to be observed." That statement unsettled me. "Observed by whom?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. "Then by whoever has been guiding us thus far." A silence followed. The unusual plan. I studied him carefully. "Holmes, you are deliberately stepping away from the case." He nodded. "That is unlike you," I said. A faint, almost imperceptible smile crossed his face. "On the contrary," he replied, "it is the first time I am treating it correctly." He walked to the fireplace and placed his hand lightly on the mantel. "Watson, tell me," he said, "what happens when a mind is presented with too many consistent clues?" "It becomes convinced," I replied. "Exactly," Holmes said. "And when it is convinced, it stops questioning." He turned. "That is where we are now." Watson's confusion. I must admit, at that moment I felt a degree of uncertainty I rarely experienced in Holmes' presence. "You are suggesting," I said slowly, "that everything we have observed is meant to lead us somewhere specific?" Holmes nodded. "And you intend to, what? Let it happen?" "Not let it happen," he corrected. "Observe its completion." Grange stood abruptly. "This is madness." "2 men have already vanished." Holmes looked at him steadily. "And yet," he said, "you are still here." "So am I." That simple statement silenced him. The undercover element. Holmes then placed a sealed envelope on the table. "This," he said, "contains instructions." "For whom?" I asked. "For you," Holmes replied. I hesitated. "What instructions?" He did not answer directly. "Tomorrow night," he said, "you will go to the dockside office again." I frowned. "Why return there?" "Because," Holmes said, "it will be the next point of interest." Grange looked uneasy. "And what will you be doing?" Holmes picked up his coat. "I will be doing something far more important than investigating," he said quietly. He paused. "I will be allowing myself to become part of the pattern. A strange strategy." I could not conceal my concern. "Holmes," I said firmly, "this is highly irregular. You are placing yourself outside the investigation at a critical stage." He looked at me then, and for a moment his expression softened slightly. "Watson," he said, "there are cases that must be pursued." He paused. "And there are cases that must be understood by becoming visible to the thing that created them." I frowned. "That is not reassuring." "No," he agreed calmly. "It is not meant to be." The separation begins. Without further explanation, Holmes left Baker Street shortly after midnight. The sound of the door closing behind him felt unusually final. Grange paced nervously. "I don't like this," he muttered. "He's hiding something from us." I looked at the sealed envelope on the table. "No," I said slowly. "I think he is revealing something in stages." Grange frowned. "And what if he is wrong?" I did not answer immediately, because for the first time I was not entirely certain that Holmes was acting within the boundaries of his usual certainty. Watson alone with the pattern. When I finally opened the envelope later that night, I found only a single line written in Holmes' precise hand. "Observe what repeats, not what disappears." No further explanation. No instructions beyond that. Just a directive that felt more like a warning than guidance. I sat in silence for a long time after reading it, because I realized something unsettling. Holmes was no longer trying to solve the case in the way I understood. He was trying to provoke the case into revealing itself. A final thought before the shift. Before sleep finally came, I found myself staring at the maps once more. The locations no longer felt random. Whitechapel, the docks, the alley, the rooms, and now Holmes himself stepping away. It no longer felt like investigation. It felt like alignment, as though every piece was being placed deliberately into position. And I could not shake the growing sense that when the pattern completed itself, something would finally respond. The morning broke over London with an uneasy brightness, as though the sun itself was uncertain whether to illuminate what lay beneath the city's surface. The fog had not entirely lifted. Instead, it clung in thin, reluctant layers between buildings, refusing to release its hold. I had not slept. Holmes had left us with a silence that felt less like absence and more like instruction. Grange paced the room continuously, while I attempted without success to reconstruct the meaning behind Holmes' final directive. Observe what repeats, not what disappears. By midday, a message arrived. It was brief. Holmes requested our presence at the dockside office at precisely 7 o'clock that evening. No explanation, no elaboration, only certainty. The return to the dockside office. When we arrived at the docks, the atmosphere had changed again. The river moved sluggishly beneath the gray sky, and the warehouses stood like silent witnesses to something already decided. Lestrade was present once more, along with a small group of officers. Grange looked increasingly uneasy, while I could feel my own anticipation sharpen with each passing moment. Holmes was already there, but not as I expected. He stood near the center of the dockside office, calm, composed, and entirely in control of the room. Yet something about his presence felt different, less like an observer, and more like a participant who had already accepted the outcome. "Holmes," Lestrade said sharply. "What is this? Another gathering without explanation?" Holmes turned slightly. "It is not without explanation," he said. "It is without interruption." That reply silenced the room immediately. The final assembly. Holmes gestured for the doors to be closed. Once they were, he stepped forward. "Gentlemen," he began, "we are now at the point where observation must end and interpretation must begin." Lestrade frowned. "You mean conclusion?" Holmes shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "I mean exposure." He turned toward us. "You have all been following a series of disappearances that appear impossible. Locked rooms, no exits, no entry, no trace." He paused. "But that is not what has been happening." A silence settled heavily across the room. Holmes continued. "What has been happening is far more deliberate. The reconstruction begins." He walked toward the desk in the room and placed his hand lightly upon it. "Edward Linley did not disappear from a sealed room," he said. "He was removed from a constructed environment designed to simulate containment." He turned slightly. "Mr. Calderwood was not lost in Whitechapel. He was relocated through a system that predates both incidents." Lestrade interrupted sharply. "Relocated how? You've given us no physical mechanism." Holmes nodded. "That is correct," he said. "Because you have been searching for a physical mechanism." He paused. "But the mechanism is architectural." A murmur ran through the room. The hidden structure revealed. Holmes began pacing slowly. "Two locations," he said. "Whitechapel and the docks. Different buildings, different victims, yet identical structural inconsistencies." He looked at me briefly. "Watson observed misaligned geometry in both rooms." He turned toward Lestrade. "You observed locked doors and intact windows." He stepped closer. "But neither of you observed the relationship between the spaces themselves." Lestrade frowned. "What relationship?" Holmes stopped. "The rooms are not isolated," he said. A pause. "They are connected. The truth emerges slowly." Grange looked confused. "Connected? But they're miles apart." Holmes nodded. He stepped toward the window. And yet they function as if they are variations of the same structure. He turned back. This is not about two disappearances, he said. It is about one system tested twice under different conditions. A silence followed. Even Lestrade did not speak. Holmes continued. And now we arrive at the crucial observation. He paused. The disappearances were not failures of security. He looked around the room. They were demonstrations of capability, the pattern revealed. Holmes took a small step forward. "Watson," he said, "what repeats in both cases?" I hesitated. "Locked rooms," I said slowly. "Missing men. Identical conditions." Holmes nodded. "And what differs?" I thought carefully. "Location." "Correct," Holmes said, "but not function." He turned to face the room. "The function remains identical. Only the stage changes." Lestrade looked increasingly frustrated. "Holmes, this is all abstraction. Where is the culprit?" Holmes' expression hardened slightly. "We are approaching that," he said. "The turning point?" He walked to the center of the room once more. "Now," Holmes said, "we come to the most important realization." He paused. "Someone is not hiding bodies." Another pause. "They are testing whether a man can be removed from perceived isolation without breaking the illusion of isolation itself." The room fell completely silent. Even the river outside seemed distant. Holmes looked at each of us in turn. "And once you can do that," he said quietly, "distance becomes irrelevant. The final step before revelation." Lestrade stepped forward. "Enough riddles, Holmes. Who is responsible?" Holmes looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "You are asking for a person." A pause. "But what I am describing is a method." Grange whispered, "Then there is no one to arrest?" Holmes turned slightly. "There is always someone," he said. He paused. "The question is whether you have recognized them yet." The silence before the answer. Holmes stepped back toward the desk, placing both hands upon it. "I have gathered you here," he said, "not to solve the case for you." He looked up. "But to show you that it has already been solved." A ripple of confusion spread through the room. Lestrade opened his mouth, but Holmes raised a hand. "No more questions," he said calmly, "because what comes next is not deduction." He paused. "It is recognition." The room at the dockside had grown unbearably still, as though even the air had decided to wait before drawing its next breath. Outside, the Thames moved in slow, indifferent rhythm, but within those walls every man present seemed suspended between understanding and denial. Holmes stood at the center of it all, not as an accuser, not as a theorist, but as a man who had already seen the ending and was now guiding us backward through it. Lestrade's patience had finally begun to fracture. "This is intolerable, Holmes," he said sharply. "You've brought us here, filled a room with abstractions, and still you refuse to name the culprit." Holmes turned his gaze toward him. "I have not refused," he said calmly. "I have delayed it until you were capable of recognizing it." That answer did not soothe the tension. It deepened it. Grange stood near the wall, pale and silent. I remained close to the desk, my mind attempting to align scattered fragments into a coherent whole, but every time I thought I had grasped it, something shifted again. Holmes, however, was no longer searching. He was revealing. The final reconstruction begins. Holmes walked slowly to the center of the room. "Let us begin," he said, "not with the disappearances, but with what remained behind." He raised one finger. In Whitechapel the code remained. The pipe remained. The arrangement of objects suggested interruption without departure. A second finger. At the docks, the same pattern repeated. A chair occupied, papers untouched, a man absent. He paused. But in both cases there was one constant. His eyes lifted slightly. The environment remained intact. Lestrade frowned. "That proves nothing." Holmes nodded. "It proves everything," he said. "The hidden architecture of the case." Holmes turned toward the desk, placing his hand upon it. "You have all been assuming," he said, "that these are rooms in the traditional sense, fixed spaces with predictable boundaries." He looked around the room. "But what if the boundaries are the illusion?" A silence followed. Even Lestrade hesitated. Holmes continued. "The rooms are not isolated events. They are nodes in a controlled structure." Grange finally spoke, his voice trembling. "Controlled by who?" Holmes looked at him directly. "Not by a person," he said. A pause. "By an arrangement." Watson's realization. At that moment something shifted in my understanding. I looked again at the facts not as isolated incidents, but as repeated conditions. Locked rooms, identical staging, missing men, no visible entry or exit. And Holmes' earlier words returned to me. Observation versus assumption. I spoke before I fully realized I had done so. "The rooms are designed," I said slowly. Holmes turned toward me immediately. "Yes," he said. I continued, feeling the pieces align for the first time. "Not to trap people," I said, "but to create the appearance of isolation while allowing controlled removal." Holmes' expression sharpened. "Continue," he said. I hesitated. "Which means the disappearance is not the event." I paused. "It is the result of something that happens outside perception." A silence followed. Then Holmes nodded once. "Precisely. The collapse of the false mystery." Holmes stepped forward. "You were never meant to find a missing man," he said. "You were meant to believe a man could vanish from a sealed environment." He turned slightly. "And once you accept that premise, you stop asking where he went and start asking how it was impossible." Lestrade shook his head. "This is still theory." Holmes' voice lowered. "No," he said. "This is structure." He gestured toward the floor. "The drag marks, the misaligned geometry, the repeated inconsistencies in spatial alignment between rooms." He looked up. "These are not clues of crime. A pausa. They are signatures of design, the final exposure." The room felt smaller now, as though the truth itself had compressed the space around us. Holmes walked slowly toward the window. "2 rooms," he said. 2 disappearances. 1 system." He turned back toward us. "And now we arrive at the final point of misunderstanding." Lestrade stepped forward again. "Then who is responsible for this system?" Holmes looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "You have been asking that question since the beginning." A pause. "But you have been asking it in the wrong direction." Holmes continued. "You assumed a culprit behind events." He stepped forward. "But what if the events themselves are the expression of intelligence?" A stillness followed that was deeper than any before. Grange whispered, "You mean there is no single person?" Holmes shook his head slightly. "I mean," he said, "that you are looking for identity where there is only methodology, the moment before understanding." Lestrade looked genuinely unsettled now. "Then what are we dealing with?" Holmes turned slowly toward him. "For the first time," he said, "you are asking the correct question." He paused. "We are dealing with a system that proves its own possibility by repeating it under different conditions." He stepped back. "And we have been invited to observe it." A long silence followed, and in that silence I realized something I had not yet allowed myself to consider. We were no longer investigators. We were participants. The silence that followed Holmes' words in the dockside office was not empty, it was dense, almost physical, as though the air itself had been compressed by the weight of realization that refused to fully form. Even the distant sound of the Thames seemed muted, restrained, as if the river too had paused to listen. Lestrade stood rigid. His earlier confidence now eroded into something uncertain and defensive. Grange no longer paced, he simply watched Holmes as though afraid that any movement might disturb the fragile structure of understanding we were approaching. As for myself, I felt an uneasy clarity beginning to emerge. Not complete understanding, but the outline of it, like a shape seen through fog that refuses to resolve into detail. Holmes, however, remained entirely composed. He had not finished. Holmes steps into the final phase. "Gentlemen," Holmes said quietly, "we have reached the point where observation must give way to exposure." He turned slowly toward us. "Everything so far has been interpretation of fragments. Now we test the structure itself." Lestrade frowned. "Test it how?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the center of the room and placed his gloves carefully on the table. "By repeating it," he said. A pause. "But under controlled conditions." Grange looked alarmed. "You want to recreate the disappearance?" Holmes nodded once. The room reacted instantly. Lestrade stepped forward. "Absolutely not. That is reckless." Holmes raised a hand. "It is necessary." His voice was calm but absolute. "And more importantly," he added, "it is already in motion." The controlled recreation. Holmes produced a small notebook from his coat and opened it. "This evening," he said, "we shall place a man in a sealed environment identical in structure to the previous 2. A silence followed. Lestrade narrowed his eyes. "And who is this man supposed to be?" Holmes looked at him. "Me!" The words struck the room like a sudden drop in temperature. Grange took a step back. "You cannot be serious." "I am entirely serious," Holmes replied. I felt my voice tighten. "Holmes, this is not cautionate as exposure without protection." He turned to me then, and for a brief moment his expression softened. "Watson," he said quietly, "this case does not reward distance. It requires position. Watson realizes the intent." I began to understand, not fully, but enough to feel unease deepen into certainty. "You are not trying to solve it from outside," I said slowly. "You are trying to become part of the mechanism that produces it." Holmes nodded. Lestrade shook his head. "This is madness. If someone is orchestrating these disappearances, then placing yourself in the same situation is exactly what they would want." Holmes looked at him steadily. "That is the assumption everyone has made since the beginning," he said. A pause. "That the system requires victims." He stepped forward slightly. "But what if it does not?" The room fell silent again. The true nature of the trap. Holmes began pacing slowly. "You have all assumed," he said, "that we are dealing with abductions." He stopped. "But no one has actually proven that anything is taken." Grange frowned. "But the men are unaccounted for," Holmes interrupted. "Not witness being removed, not confirmed dead, not verified elsewhere." He turned sharply. "Only absent." A silence followed. Then Holmes continued. "And absence is not evidence of removal. It is evidence of relocation within perception." I felt my thoughts tighten around that idea. "Perception?" I repeated. Holmes nodded. "Every room we have examined shares one trait," he said. "It is constructed to enforce a belief in isolation." He looked around the room. "But isolation is not a physical state. It is a psychological agreement. The final insight before action." Holmes stopped in front of the desk. "So tonight," he said, "we break that agreement." Lestrade looked increasingly frustrated. "And what do you expect to happen?" Holmes' expression became almost unreadable. "Response," he said simply. Grange whispered, "From who?" Holmes paused for a long moment. "From the system that has been observing us." A stillness followed that felt different from all the others. This one had direction. Watson's unease deepens. As Holmes outlined the final arrangement, timing, location, structure, he found myself no longer focusing on the mechanics of the plan, but on something more unsettling. Holmes was no longer treating the case as an external mystery. He was treating it as a closed loop, a system that reacts, a system that adjusts, and most disturbingly, a system that notices when it is being noticed. I turned to him. "Holmes," I said quietly, "if this system is as you describe, then what makes you believe it will not simply adapt to your trap?" For the first time Holmes hesitated, not in doubt, but in calculation. Then he replied, "Because every system reveals itself when forced to repeat under observation." He paused. "And tonight it will be observed under conditions it has not yet encountered." The night approaches. As evening began to fall over London, Holmes prepared to leave. Grange remained behind under Lestrade's supervision, though neither man seemed fully satisfied with the arrangement. The dockside office had been modified, slightly cleared, controlled, made ready for the experiment Holmes intended. Before stepping out, Holmes turned once more. "Watson," he said, "you will remain outside the structure." I frowned. "And observe?" "No," he replied. A pause. "You will wait for deviation." That word lingered. Deviation. Then he left, the final moment of setup. I stood alone for several moments after he departed, listening to the distant sound of the river. Everything had now been reduced to anticipation. 2 disappearances, 1 system, and now 1 controlled repetition. But as I looked at the sealed room, I could not escape a final troubling thought. If Holmes was correct, then the system was already aware of us. And if it was aware, then tonight was not a test of it. It was a test of us. Night had fully settled over London when I returned to the dockside office. The fog was thicker than ever, rolling in slow, deliberate waves from the Thames, as though the river itself was exhaling something long held and long forgotten. The building stood quietly against the darkness, its windows dim, its shape almost swallowed by the surrounding mist. Yet I could feel an expectation in the air. Not human expectation, but something colder, more precise. Inside, Lestrade and his men had already taken position. Grange sat near the far wall, visibly shaken, while Holmes' absence weighed upon the room like an unanswered question. And then the clock struck 7 o'clock. Exactly as planned. The trap is activated. At that precise moment Holmes entered, but not from the door, from the structure itself. I saw him appear in the room as though he had stepped through an unseen threshold between expectation and reality. The effect was so abrupt that even Lestrade stepped back in surprise. "Holmes!" I exclaimed. "Where?" "Later," he said calmly. His voice was steady and entirely certain. He walked to the center of the room. "It has begun," he said. A silence followed that statement. Not confusion this time, but anticipation. The controlled repetition. Holmes gestured toward the sealed office space that had been prepared earlier. "This room," he said, "matches the conditions of both previous incidents." He turned slightly. "Single entrance, single window, controlled access, identical structure of isolation." Lestrade frowned. "And what exactly are we waiting for?" Holmes looked at him directly. "Completion." A pause. Then he added quietly, "The system always completes itself when given the opportunity." Grange whispered, "What system?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to the sealed room. "Watson," he said, without looking back, "observe carefully. Do not interpret, only record deviation." I nodded, though my pulse had already quickened. The moment of silence. For several minutes nothing happened. Only the sound of the river outside and the faint shifting of fog against the windows. A subtle change. The air inside the room seemed to realign, not visibly, not audibly, but perceptibly. Lestrade stiffened. "Did you feel that?" Holmes nodded once. I looked around, trying to identify the source of the disturbance, but found nothing concrete. Yet the sensation persisted, a feeling that the room was no longer simply being observed. It was being measured. The empty room changes. Holmes stepped forward slowly. "The first stage," he said quietly, "is confirmation." He pointed toward the sealed room. "The system verifies conditions." Grange stood abruptly. "What does that mean?" Holmes answered without turning. "It means," he said, "that it ensures the structure is identical enough to previous iterations to proceed." A silence followed. Then something happened. The chair inside the room shifted, not moved by wind, not touched. It simply adjusted position by a few inches. Lestrade's voice tightened. "That's not possible." Holmes did not respond. He only watched. "The mechanism reveals itself." Then the second change occurred. The shadows in the room no longer aligned with the light source. A contradiction in geometry. A reversal of spatial expectation. I felt my breath catch. "This is not physical manipulation," I said slowly. "It is perceptual distortion." Holmes nodded. He stepped forward. "And now we reach the final phase." A pause. "Relocation?" Watson finally understands. At that moment everything aligned in my mind, not as explanation but as realization. "These men were never taken," I said slowly. Holmes turned slightly toward me. "No," I continued, "they were repositioned within controlled perception. The rooms are not endpoints. They are transition states." Lestrade looked at me sharply. "What are you talking about?" I continued, unable to stop the flow of understanding. "The locked rooms are designed to isolate belief, not bodies. The disappearance is the moment perception fails to track continuity." A silence followed. Then Holmes spoke. "Yes," he said simply, "the final exposure. The room inside the sealed structure changed one final time. The air shimmered barely visible like heat distortion. And then, for a fraction of a second, it was no longer empty. A silhouette appeared, not fully formed, not stable, but present." Grange stumbled back. "What is that?" Holmes stepped forward slightly. "That," he said quietly, "is what remains when movement is separated from observation." The silhouette flickered and vanished again. But the implication remained. Holmes' final statement. Holmes turned to us slowly. "You have all assumed this was a crime of removal," he said. A pause. "But it is not." He looked at the sealed room. "It is a demonstration of controlled absence." Lestrade whispered, "Controlled by who?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Then he said, "That question no longer matters." A silence followed. He turned toward me. "Watson," he said softly, "what matters is that the system has now completed its cycle in our presence." A pause. "And it has acknowledged observation. The case ends, but not the mystery." The fog outside the dockside office began to thin slightly as though released from pressure. The unnatural stillness in the room slowly dissolved. Holmes adjusted his coat. "It will not repeat here again," he said quietly. Grange exhaled in disbelief. Lestrade said nothing. As for me, I remained standing, staring at the now ordinary empty room, struggling to reconcile what I had seen with what I understood. Holmes walked toward the door. "Come, Watson," he said. I followed. Outside, London looked unchanged, but I knew it was not, because some mysteries are not solved by finding a culprit. They are solved by recognizing the shape of the system that created them. And as we walked into the fog once more, I realized something that unsettled me far more than any disappearance. Holmes had not defeated the mystery. He had only convinced it to reveal how it worked.